All right, class, so today we are going to be making plaster mold hands. We will be using the design that we discussed in class, whether that be an individual exhibit or a collaborative whole class exhibit. We are all going to figure out how our hands are going to be, okay? So if I want to have my hand in this kind of position, let's say it's going to be holding the post of a flag, I'm going to make sure I take a photo of this position so that way when I go back in a minute to start molding my hand, I don't forget what position I want it to start with, okay? So just before we get started, I want to do a quick introduction to the materials that we've got. This is called plaster gauze. It is pretty hard. It's like a netted surface, and plaster has been poured in between. So that's how you get like this harder texture, okay? You can see it's dusty, all these dust pieces on here. Please do your best to make sure that all the plaster dust remains on your workspace. You are 100% responsible for cleaning this up at the end of our activity. Other material you will need is Vaseline. This is going to be the messy part. And then I have used my sink and gotten a very, very hot container of water. So before we start, please make sure that you don't have any rings on. You can see I've taken my wedding ring off so I don't ruin it. I'm going to take my plaster gauze and I am going to cut out some bigger pieces, okay? These types of pieces here will most likely wrap around bigger parts of my hand, like my palm, or maybe around the base of my thumb and tucked in, okay? So I want you to have maybe like 3 or 4 plaster gauze pieces, but you can always have somebody come up and cut these down a little bit into smaller, thinner slices, so that way when you go to put them in between your fingers, then you've got a thin piece that will close any gaps or any holes in between your fingers. For example, this one is much thinner than what I had. I'll show you in a minute, but this piece would be molded in between my fingers. You can see that I'm not leaving any gaps. I'm not forgetting that this space needs to be filled if it's not part of my hand layout, okay? So I'm just going to take a minute to cut the rest of this up. You will most likely need more smaller pieces. Now the reason why we are using plaster gauze or plaster wrap is because it dries quickly and our molding process to it goes much quicker than if we were to use paper mache. Those who have done paper mache before, you will know this, but it usually takes about 3 or 4 layers to actually get a sturdy piece of paper mache to feel like it's not going to bend and break. By the way, look at all that dust. That's going to be your job to clean up. So this plaster, it can be done faster in comparison to paper mache, and then it dries a lot faster. So you'll notice as we're working on this that your hand is most likely going to start drying toward the end of our class time. Once you have all your pieces cut, you can go ahead and just kind of scatter them around your workspace, okay? So going back to that very first step and why we're using the Vaseline and the hot water. So very first thing, once you've got your pieces all cut, brush off my hands, you're going to take just a tiny little bit of Vaseline. This looks like lotion. You are going to rub it as if it's lotion. Whatever hand you plan to use for your mold, you are going to want to make sure that most of the Vaseline is covering that area, okay? So you're covering from your wrist up to your finger, unless it is part of our design to include our wrist. If that is the case, then we will be covering our wrist as well. Now the reason we're using this Vaseline is because it will help our hands slide out of our sculptures once we are done. So it kind of works as like butter. If you get your head stuck in between two posts on a stairway, in the olden days at least, they would put butter around your ears or on your cheeks to help slide out your head. That's exactly the purpose of Vaseline. Now you're going to take your largest piece of plaster gauze. You're going to start with just one, okay? Let me see if I can do this safely under the camera. You're going to dip your plaster gauze all the way down into your hot water. Now it's going to bunch up pretty easy, but it's also going to smooth out. Look at how creamy this plaster has become. It is going to mold super easy, okay? So I'm gonna decide what my hand position is, and I'm gonna start laying on my plaster. Now as I do this, I'm smoothing out air bubbles, okay? It is going to be wet and a little bit slimy, and that is exactly what happens when you use plaster, okay? So if yours is wet and slimy, chances are that's exactly how it should be. Now, sometimes in paper mache, if you use too much of the paper mache paste, you can just slap on another newspaper piece and kind of goop all that excess mache on top of it and smooth it out. You cannot do that with plaster, okay? You need to have that goop in order for your entire sculpture to end up being smooth in the end. So next thing, you're gonna take up either a large piece. I should have cut an extra one for here, but I'm gonna use a smaller piece. I'm going to pull it back up, and I wanna show you in between your fingers, okay? So I am rubbing this down, making it nice and smooth. Be very careful because our plaster gauze is very expensive. If we ruin it or if we run out, I am unable to buy more. You can find this at Dick Blick or Hobby Lobby. It's usually about $30, $35 for one roll, okay? So as you are putting your layers together, you are going to want to fill some of those spaces that we saw earlier in our gauze. We are just going to work very carefully to get this nice and smooth. Anywhere where you see holes popping through from the gauze, please use your finger to smudge some of the plaster within that hole, so that way this turns out really smooth. Now I have not kept my hand position as you are doing this. Please make sure that your hand position is in the position that it should be for our sculpture. Just because if you're moving your hand around, the plaster is going to start to dry almost right away. This is a very, very speedy project. It dries quickly. So if you're moving your hand around, you're preventing your project from having a accurate depiction of what we discussed and planned for in our sketches. So you can see the layer I just put on has now smoothed out and blended with my very first big piece. And now I'm blending it onto the other side of my hand, okay? So again, as I see the holes, I'm just going to use that wet paste that is left on my hand. I'm going to just do my best to fill this in. So for this demonstration, I'm going to use all my pieces as best as I can. You are going to wrap them around your fingers, okay? The whole goal of doing plaster molds is to make it really, really smooth. So I keep comparing this process to paper mache much. It is very similar to the type of layering and trying to smooth out all your pieces as you would do in paper mache. I'm not doing a very good job keeping my hand still and in its position. But you want to work really, really hard to smooth every single area out. In the end, this should look like a hand, but if you get into a position where it doesn't look like a hand, that's where we have some work to do, okay? When you wrap around your fingers, be very careful. Oh, my mold is falling off. Be very careful that you are getting all these spots. I left a gap in my thumb, so I may want to pull up this layer I just laid down and pull it back over. Now for those who do athletics, oh, it's already starting to dry, you guys. Okay, don't do this yourselves, but mine is coming off. If you do sports, you may have had a cast or you may have had some sort of wrap. This is very similar to how that wrap works. You want to wrap it over and over again. Now, if you fall into the position that I'm falling into where this piece just keeps coming off, make sure you take some of your plaster wrap and get it covered and get it all blended in together, okay? Now, for those who like to use clay, this kind of technique where we are pulling this all together and we are using the water to help fill in these gaps, that is one of the techniques that we use when we work with clay. That's called slip, S-L-I-P, and that's what you use to fill in any holes that may be showing. Now I want to make sure I leave you all enough of the plaster mold, so I'm going to finish the tip of my fingers and then I'm going to call it a day. Now, it is probably best that you work really hard to get your whole hand molded in one class period. So that means the talking should be a minimum. If we are talking, that shows that we are distracted, and oftentimes when we're distracted, that shows up in our end product. So just to reiterate how quick this stuff dries, most of my hand is already dry. I'm pulling on more of this water to hold down some of these areas and mesh them back into my hand or into the gauze that I already have out. So the tip of my finger is now covered. It's a little bit out of focus. These types of tears and gaps, do your best to connect them as much as you can. I'm going to use one piece of my plaster gauze to connect them once I wrap my thumb here. If your project looks all bunchy, where it doesn't look like you smoothed it out, it is not going to look like a hand, okay? So another reason why we need to focus. This is a new material. I overheard a student say yesterday that we have not ever experienced this kind of material before at museum school. And so this is one of those materials that you really need to focus on. I don't want you guys talking to each other. This is a super fun process to do, but you also do want to learn how to do this if you were to ever do it on your own, or if this is something you want to just practice on maybe in college, or if you go to art school and people ask you about plaster molds, you'll know how to explain the process. So I'm using my hot water and going over everything again, smoothing all my areas out. You guys, my hand is almost completely dry. I still have this crack to fix. Lucky for me, I've got one last piece. So I'm going to kind of wedge this in between my fingers. You guys should be doing your very best to hold your hand position that we decided on in class the entire time, okay? If you do not hold it, it is not going to dry in the hand position that we had planned for in our sketches and in our class discussion. So when you keep your hand position in the same spot the entire time, your plaster is going to dry in that same position. So I just did all of this in 15 minutes. This is a majority of my hand. I expect that yours will take about 30 minutes. Now the major component to this that is a little bit chaotic that we need to work on is the cleanup. because we are not in an official art room, we are responsible for cleaning up all this plaster dust that you see underneath my water. Oh, good news, you guys, I have more strips. But all the plaster dust that is surrounding my surface here, I am responsible for cleaning that up. We are not going to make any of the other 8th graders ruin their clothes or have to clean up our space. That's how we lose the privilege of having art at the school in general, okay? Part of our classroom norms is cleaning up after ourselves. So it should be pretty simple. When you go to clean up, I recommend getting a paper towel and getting it just a little bit wet, okay? Okay, so I think that this is super good. I'm gonna give it just a minute to dry. While I am doing that, I wanna make sure I fill in some of these little cracks that might be causing me issues later. Let me revisit that cleanup procedure. As you guys are cleaning up and you're using that damp paper towel, please do not leave a glob of water on the table because that ruins the work for the next person that's going to be sitting there. That makes Miss Irwin a little bit more stressed out trying to clean up our mess when that's not her job, but ours. So we want to be very, very respectful of our space and aware that this classroom is not supposed to be an art room. It is supposed to be a place for learning in all subject areas. So please do take care of your own stuff. If I see anything left out, I will have Miss Mathis come and get you and clean up your area in front of the entire class. Okay? So at this point, I am unable to bend my fingers that are molded already, which is excellent news. That means that this is drying. Now I've kind of overdone it with the water. Because we are under a time constraint for making our mold, I'm going to simply just set my water to the side and give my hands a couple seconds to dry. Do not touch anything around you. Your hand should never go on another person, okay? Especially with stuff like this. Now with plaster, once this is dry, unlike a paper mache project that is pretty durable, you could accidentally squish it or it could hang anywhere and somebody bump it and it's not really ruined. This is something that could break, okay? So it is an incredibly fragile sculpture material that we are using. Again, it is incredibly expensive too. So if we are not being careful of our surroundings and I go to high five somebody with my plaster on my hand, you can say goodbye to this opportunity, okay? It is a privilege that we have materials like this. So please do not get yourself stuck in a situation where you do not get to be part of the fun. So you can start to see at the bottom, my first gauze piece is already dry. I want to do my best to get all these gauze pieces to be completely dry. During this time, I am not touching it and wiggling my hand around, trying to get my fingers out. If you feel claustrophobic and stuck inside of this, it's because you are. You are stuck here until it is dry. It will dry quickly. Keep your hands off of any of the classroom space. Okay, my hand is almost there, and it's been about 2 minutes of me rambling on and on. So there's our proof that this takes a much shorter time frame than paper mache. Okay, so I'm using my other hand just to double check if there's any damp areas. I still have a little bit of dampness right here, so I'm gonna give it another minute. Now, when we get to the end of our class, it is so important that we store these in a safe way. So I'm gonna lay paper out with each student's name, and then you will simply just place your hand right above your name on that paper, and I'm going to store it in a safe area. I do not want any of the classmates or peers in the school to accidentally bump these as they're transitioning to other classes. The other key thing with this, I have to cut this off of your hand. So when I cut it off of your hand, you shouldn't be doing it. You need to have me do it, okay? When I cut it off of your hand, please keep your body still. No giggling, because you could easily cut yourself, or get cut, I guess. But once we cut part of your hand to get your normal hand taken out of this mold, then you will take one of your gauze strips and reseal it, kind of like a Band-Aid. You're gonna go over top of that incision that I make to get your hand out, okay? So mine is actually completely dry. This entire demonstration has taken 21 minutes so far. I want to show you what the end will look like when I go to cut this off, and then how slow you should be taking your fingers out of our mold, okay? So I am going to raise my hand. I'm going to ask Miss Hadley to come and cut this off of my hand. Gotta find a good spot because it looks like I needed more Vaseline. Okay, so I'm gonna make sure I don't move at all. I'm cutting through my gauze. There's my incision. That's what I'm going to make sure I go over again, okay? Now very carefully, I have to work my hand to get it out. Now right now I am slightly applying a stronger forward pressure so I can back my hand out of its parking spots in the mold. If you go too fast, you will shatter your mold. And as I mentioned before, we do not have enough supplies for everybody to start over, okay? So it is important that you do this right the first time. I'm already gaining cracks. Any cracks that appear, you might get a few around your fingers. Any cracks that show up, you can simply bandage, okay? So I forgot to put Vaseline on the top of my hand, and my plaster stuck to it. So it's a little extra painful, but it's just like ripping a Band-Aid off. Still applying that force, pulling upward, trying to get my hands out, or my fingers out of their mold. Slowly we are getting there. Kind of starting to wiggle my fingers, and voila, you have your hand, okay? This is the portion that I did. My expectation is that you have all your fingers showing, so your hand position may be balled up like this. You are going to do your best to go into every little crevice in between your fingers, in the sides. Try to pinch into the underneath space of your hands. This little incision mark here, you are going to dip a piece of your plaster wrap into your warm water, and very carefully you are going to sew your incision back together. Okay, so now you get to be surgeons. If you happen to find cracks in between your fingers, then please make sure you use a thin strip of paper of plaster wrap to go back into that, wet it and massage it into what you have already made for your gauze. Any areas that are sticking up like this, I can either choose to keep it because it might help indicate a more realistic look to my finger if it really is bumpy there. Or I can try applying a little bit of the hot water. Do not do too much, okay? And then in the back, I did have another small tear that came up. So I'm going to wrap another piece of gauze here. I'm going to put a Band-Aid over top. Any areas such as this was one piece of the plaster gauze, so it's really flimsy. Over here, I did about 3 pieces of gauze on each section, coming in some way and layering. So this you can hear that, is nice and hard. Don't knock on your sculptures right now. I'll let you do that when they're 100% dry when I see you next. So if you do find yourself in a flimsy situation like this whole piece here, consider adding more of that plaster gauze. You may want to cut up some extra pieces for your Band-Aids. Make sure that you don't use all of them in one sitting, okay? But in the end, you will have a nice hand sculpture. It is going to look much better than paper mache. It's going to leave your own hands really messy, okay? As a class, we are going to line up. We will take our group's warm water, and we will also bring our dirty hands, not touching anybody else, and we are gonna head out to the sink area to wash our hands, dump our water, and rinse out the Tupperware that the water is sitting in. And then our hands are also going to be placed above our name on the paper that is provided for you on top of my cart, okay? So if you have questions, please comment on this video, on this assignment. Once this is totally dry, then we are in a position where we could paint it. So first step, you need to apply a lot of Vaseline. Don't be like me. You can see this is the area where I forgot the Vaseline. And it's pretty red right now because my plaster stuck to it. I had to rip it off my hand. So you will need a lot of Vaseline. You will need warm water, and you will need your plaster gauze. Keep your hand in your formation or in your activism symbol. So maybe it was a peace sign, maybe it was a love sign, or maybe we're working as a whole group to make some sort of cool heart shape. Keep your hand in that position the whole time, then apply the mold using the warm water. Fill in all those holes, blend them together, and then I want you to smooth everything out, okay? Mine could still use some more focus, attention, and some more smoothing of edges, but it's not bad for a first attempt. All right, guys, you are officially on your own. Voices should be off during this time. If you are talking, that shows me that you are not focused, and if you are not focused, you are not giving me quality work, okay?